Hello everyone, this is the new Uphost Traveler of the New Century. Today, let's welcome the 11th test flight of the Starship and the final battle of the Starship Generation R together. Although it is said to be the last battle of Starship Gen R, when we look towards Starship City, we will find that preparations for the arrival of Starship Gen 3 Gongqing may be in full swing. To welcome the almost completely transformed Starship Gen 3, all the test fields in Starship City are busy with various construction works. In the launch area, the second launch pad has entered the final stage of construction. The complex pipelines on the gantry beside the launch pad have been basically completed and are now being covered with steel plates. The water-cooled steel pipe system has also undergone multiple water spray tests. Since there is a diversion channel under this launch pad and it is concave, the sprayed water will accumulate at the bottom. Then SpaceX will recycle this accumulated water back to the storage tank for reuse next time. This is truly cost saving to the extreme. Opposite the launch area, the air separation plant planned by SpaceX is also under intense construction. In the new expansion documents, we can see that SpaceX's ambition goes far beyond this. After the 11th test flight, SpaceX plans to renovate the first launch pad to match the specifications of the second one, making it compatible with the newer generation of Starships. SpaceX also intends to expand the launch area by 8,500 square meters. Besides expanding the current propellant storage facilities, they will build a natural gas liquefaction station and a liquid methane production station here. Look at this, placing a natural gas liquefaction station next to the launch site. Aren't you courting disaster? Of course, SpaceX is still trying to avoid being blown up into the sky for now. They will build more blast walls here later, and also conduct experiments with liquid oxygen and methane at the McGregor test site to precisely calculate the explosion range. In the production area, the foundation of the super hangar has been basically completed, and it will soon rise from the ground. Next to these large buildings, Musk has also built several apartment buildings for his employees. Previously, many employees of Starship City lived in a large number of RVS. These RVS looked quite fun, but living in them was definitely not as comfortable as living in houses. Moreover, RVS cannot be stacked only one layer and they take up a lot of space. Now that Starship City has officially become a city, it is not appropriate for citizens to live in RVS instead of houses, so it is better to build more apartments for the employees. In the production area, apart from manufacturing many components for the third generation boosters and various strangely shaped test tanks, a new transport adapter ring for the third generation boosters has also been built. This device is used to fix the bottom of the boosters during transportation. Since the bottom structure of the third generation boosters is different from that of the previous generation, a new adapter ring had to be built. At the messy test field, various damaged pipelines from the previous explosion were dismantled or repaired. Some of the damaged water-cooled steel pipes inside the static ignition test stand also needed to be replaced. To prevent future explosions from sending things into the sky, some concrete walls were built beside the test stand. This way, even if it explodes again, it won't be able to go up into the sky. At the SpaceX test site, the test tanks of the next generation booster are undergoing intense cryogenic pressure tests in the can crusher. Meanwhile, in McGregor, the mass production and testing of the Raptor 3rd engines are also advancing. At Cape Canaveral, the construction of new launch pads and hangars is also in progress. All these efforts are aimed at welcoming the arrival of the next generation Starship. To ensure the rapid commissioning of the LC-39A Starship launchpad at Cape Canaveral, SpaceX has launched a Starship transport vessel with a deck area of 91.4 meters by 30.5 meters. Musk named it "You'll Thank Me Later," which is very much in line with the style of the SpaceX fleet. The name is also derived from a science fiction novel, Consider Phlebas, by Ian M. Banks. Even though SpaceX is now fully committed to the Starship Gen 3, the earliest launch time is still expected to be early next year. This means that the 11th launch of the Starship will be both the last launch of the Starship Gen R and the last launch of the Starship in 2025. There is only this one chance left. So how can we conduct a test to gather the most information? SpaceX has chosen to make multiple changes in both the booster and the Starship test plans. The booster used in this test flight is a second-gen hand booster B15-2, which has flown 8 times before. Among the 33 engines used in this test flight booster, 24 are second-gen hand engines that have flown before. The use of B15-2 in this test flight also means that the last first-generation booster B17 will be directly retired and will not be able to perform flight tasks. It is just like the first-generation Starship S-32 back then. But upon careful consideration, although neither of them has performed a mission, the reasons for their retirement are slightly different. S-32 was retired back then because the progress of S-33 was faster and the second-generation Starships were already ready, so there was no need for the first-generation Starships to continue flying. However, B-17's retirement is not because B-18's progress is faster. It is simply because there will be no more second and generation Starships after this launch, and there is nothing to replace it. If S-36 公顷 DNT exploded before, B-17 英里 GHT have flown once, the current Starship boosters are already very mature and stable, and the tests that needed to be done have basically all been carried out, whether it is the chopstick recovery test or the redundancy capability test, with the engine deliberately shut down. Coupled with Starlink's unparalleled data transmission capacity, SpaceX has basically obtained all the data it needed. In the last test flight, SpaceX also found that the stability of the booster during landing in turbulent air was extremely good. How good? The stability measured in actual flight was even better than the predictions from wind tunnel tests and computer simulations. This is interesting. Does this mean there are undiscovered flaws in wind tunnel tests and computer simulations? The simulated results deviate from the actual ones. SpaceX called out to the scientific research community asking when they would have time to solve this problem. But SpaceX has no time for this. After all, the result of the flight was that the stability was better, not worse. This is a good thing. So you guys study it yourselves. We're off to work on the next generation of boosters. This test flight, while assessing reusability, aims to better bridge the gap between the current and the next generation boosters. During the landing ignition phase of this test flight, the booster will use a new engine shutdown sequence. Previously, in the landing ignition process, the booster would first ignite the 13 engines in the inner circle and then shut down until only the 10 engines in the center remained. However, in this test flight, the booster will first shut down until 5 engines remain, which is 2 米 more than before. In the final stage of landing ignition, these additional R engines will be shut down, leaving only the 10 engines in the center to complete the final landing phase. After hovering over the Gulf of Mexico, it will splash down. In fact, an additional stage has been added to the 2 previous stages of landing ignition, making the deceleration more gentle and providing a better landing trajectory profile. At the same time, it also enhances redundancy. The use of this landing ignition configuration in this test flight is also laying the foundation for the 3rd generation boosters. In the future, when the 3rd generation boosters perform landing ignition, they will follow this configuration. On the 2nd stage of the Starship above, SpaceX's main test content was to once again change the configuration of the heat shield tiles. Didn't SpaceX keep messing around with those metal heat shield tiles in previous test flights? Every time they were installed, but each time they exploded before the test could even begin. Until the last test flight, they finally managed to test it, but the result was nothing. Those metal heat shield tiles were really useless. In fact, NASA played around with metal heat shield tiles in the laboratory back in the 1970 秒, but never put them into use. SpaceX, being the young upstart, didn't believe it and insisted on trying it themselves, but they found out that experience still beats youth. The metal heat shield tiles, although easier to manufacture, would quickly oxidize and rust in high temperature environments, turning orange and breaking down. Not only did they change color themselves, but they also gradually peeled off and lost their color. In the last test flight, only 3 metal heat shield tiles were installed, but the color they lost almost turned the lower half of the entire Starship into an orange can, like a space shuttle. So let's go back to the old heat shield tiles, but the old heat shield tiles also have a problem. There must be a gap in the middle of the tiles because the Starship is so large. We have to consider thermal expansion and contraction, and there must be a gap in the middle as a redundancy. But if there is a gap in the middle when regen entering, the plasma always wants to drill into the gap. Once it gets in, it starts to erode the white ablation material underneath. When the ablation material is eroded, it will also splash and part of the Starship surface will be stained white. How can this be? The Starship is going to be reused quickly. How can we repair the ablation material every time it comes back? To solve this problem, SpaceX developed something called tight packaging. This thing was actually used on a small scale on S-37. In the last test flight, the lower part of S-37 was stained orange, and the head was stained white. This white color was because the nose cone part of S-37 公顷D-more heat shield tiles removed, and the splashing was more severe. But among all the white areas, SpaceX keenly noticed that there was a small part that didn't seem so white. This part used a new thing called tight packaging. This thing is actually like wrapping a circle of paper around each heat shield tile. When the heat shield tiles are installed, this circle of paper naturally wraps around the tiles and effectively fills the gaps between them. SpaceX has high hopes for this technology in this test flight. The S-37, which is the entire heat shield of this test flight, basically all uses this technology. The S-37 test flight also bears the responsibility of connecting the past and the future. To simulate the flight path, When the Starship returns to the Starship City launch site in the future, the S-38 will perform dynamic tilt maneuvers in the final stage of landing and test subsonic guidance algorithms to simulate the process of approaching the launch pad. Other test contents are the same as the previous test flights, including releasing 8 Starlink simulators, conducting an in-jet orbit ignition, removing some heat shield tiles in many areas for extreme testing, and some of the removed heat shield tiles do not have a second layer of ablation layer below. Now, we basically understand the main test contents of this test flight. Next, let's take a look at the test process of this final Starship gain stack. Since SpaceX has become so experienced now, there were no remarkable highlights during the testing process. On September 6 THB 15到2秒 ET off for the launch site. It was ignited the next day and returned to the production area on the third day to install the thermal separation ring. 10 days later, S-38 小时 edit to the launch site and conducted a static ignition on the launch pad using the previously modified ignition adapter. However, despite 2 attempts over the following 2 days and some maintenance in between, it just wouldn't ignite. It seems that these makeshift solutions just don't work well, but keep going. This is the last try. After a weekend, on September 22, ND-S-38S you successfully ignited all engines. There were no more single-gen engine ignitions after that. This ignition was the final preparation before the flight. The next evening, S-38 returned to the production area for the final installation of heat shield tiles. Sometimes, Starship installs a few heat shield tiles on the inner side of the tail fins for additional testing. Now, the positions of these inner heat shield tiles are becoming increasingly tricky and strange. Previously, they were all bunched together, but now they are scattered. Interestingly, since the first launch pad is to be rebuilt and renovated after this launch, the static fire of S-38 is actually the last static fire of the first launch pad. The last static fire of this launch pad, which is used for both launches and booster static fires, is for a Starship second stage. This was something that no one could have imagined a few months ago. After S-38's departure, the first launch pad has actually begun small-gen scale renovation work. Not only will the launch pad be replaced, but the oldest generation of chopsticks on the launch tower will also be modified into shorter and faster new ones. Since the launch pad still needs to prepare for the last launch, it cannot be moved now, but the chopsticks can be moved a little. SpaceX has already removed some shock absorbers that would be used for booster recovery in advance. Since these chopsticks will no longer perform recovery work, it is better to remove the recovery gen-related items while there is free time. The Starship launch is tentatively scheduled for October 6 TH. But Oldma took a look at the schedule and found that in 7 days, it would be October 13 TH, the first anniversary of the successful first recovery of the Starship's 5th test flight booster. So what else was there to say? Anyway, the progress of the next generation booster and Starship was so slow that it didn't matter if it was delayed by a week. So the launch time was reconfirmed for the afternoon of October 13 TH. However, it is worth noting that the 5th flight was launched in the local morning, which was the local evening of the same day in Beijing time. Both were on the same day. After changing to an afternoon launch, Beijing time became the next morning, that is, the early morning of October 14 TH. This was no longer the same day's anniversary. On October 8 THB 15-2 went to the launch site. 2 days later, S-38 began installing the Starlink simulator and went to the launch site for stacking on October 11 TH. There was no fueling test or wet dress rehearsal. On the afternoon of October 13 TH, 2025 local time, and the early morning of October 14 TH, 2025 Beijing time, the 11T at test flight of Starship. Also, the farewell performance of Starship Gen R thus began. In the 5th flight, Starship took off with the rising sun and returned at dawn. But this time, Starship took off with the setting sun, heading towards the dark night and returned to the dawn again.
Last 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have liftoff. Go Superman. Go Starship. Thanks for all the story flights together.
Stage separation. Spec burn startup.
Stage. All right, so for booster, this is one of the main things we're trying to get. It's going to be this landing burn. Oh, that's
from landing burn start, where we'll first ignite the center 13 engines, then bring that down to 5 to slow down the booster for landing. And finally, that will come down to 3, and we'll cut all of them off while we're sitting down. So booster is going to
At 1分钟 U2 and 2秒 econs, the rocket passed through the maximum dynamic pressure point, max Q. At 2分钟 U2 and 45秒 econs, the Starship completed the thermal separation and then initiated the return burn. During the return burn, another engine failed to ignite. But it was not a big deal. At 7分钟 U2 and 25秒 econs, the first stage of the return burn ended, and sure engines in the middle were shut down, with the remaining sand engines completing the final return burn. The return burn ended around 3分钟 U2 and 50秒 econs, and the engines were shut down. At 4分钟 U2's thermal separation ring was jettisoned. At 6分钟 U2 and 17秒 econs, the landing burn of the booster began. This time, all 13 engines ignited successfully, and the engine that failed to ignite earlier was repaired. At 6分钟 U2 and 23秒 econs, 8 engines were shut down, and the remaining Wu engines continued the second stage of the landing burn. At 6分钟 U2 and 30秒 econs, 2米 all engines were shut down, leaving only the sand engines in the center to complete the final landing burn stage. The landing burn of the booster ended at 6分钟 U2 and 30秒 econs. To avoid the situation like B13 that floated on the water and couldn't sink, the boosters in these 2 test flights chose to increase the hover altitude significantly, and with the explosion of the FTTs, the boosters could be quickly sent to the bottom of the sea, eliminating the need for aircraft cannons to be used for destruction later. And this was the final dance of the second generation booster. After this, it was time for the final performance of the second generation Starship, that's StarshipV2.
a couple dozen cameras on Starship. We've also got a bunch of cameras spread across the globe, including out in the Indian Ocean where we've got our fun buoys floating. There goes another one. We're using Starlink to bring all of this together. Our drone shots you see here from our great team down here at Starbase, all connected. So Starlink not only giving us cool views off the planet, but also on the planet, help bring everybody along for all these Starship.
Thanks, Shutdown.
All right, there was that Raptor relight. Looks like engine 3 full duration.
as we said, we're not planning on recovering the ship today. Hey, welcome back to Earth, Starship. We are down in the Indian Ocean.
At 8分钟 UTs and 45秒 Econs, the 3 vacuum engines of S38 秒 shut down. About 9 minutes later, the remaining 3 seeds and level engines were also shut down. The Starship successfully completed its ascent phase and entered the coasting phase. At approximately 17分钟 UTs after launch, the payload door of the Starship opened, preparing to release the Starlink satellites. At 19分钟 UTs and 20秒 Econs, the first Starlink satellite was released. The release rail for this Starlink release was optimized, making the release process very smooth and stable, and it would no longer collide with the payload door. At 24分钟 UTs and 55秒 Econs, all Starlink satellites were released. At 26分钟 UTs and 5秒 Econs, the payload door closed. After that, from 38分钟 UTs and 54秒 Econs to 58秒 Econs after launch, the Starship conducted an in-jet orbit ignition test, with 1 C-jet level engine being activated. All tests were successfully completed. After that, it was the final regen entry of the Starship VIC. Amid the purple glow from the friction of the heat shield and the intense flames from the ablation of the thermal protection material, the Starship headed towards the dawn over the Indian Ocean. This regen entry process was the best performance among all the previous Starship test flights. Neither the forward wing nor the tail wing burned through or got damaged. Then, the Starship began to adjust its attitude, preparing to complete the final landing in the recovery posture. At this moment, in the Indian Ocean off the west coast of Australia, drones and buoys were all in position. They, along with the Starship's own cameras, would capture this final act. 1 hour, 5 minutes and 55秒 Econs after launch, the landing burn began. The Starship's attitude flipped from horizontal to vertical. 1 hour, 6 minutes and 6 seconds after launch, the landing burn switched from 3 engines to 2 engines. 6 seconds later, the Starship completed its final landing, splashing down in the Indian Ocean. 1 hour, 6 minutes and 30秒 Econs after launch, S38, having completed all its tasks, exploded on the sea surface. Its final landing was even smoother than that of the S38, with no more shaking, and it was very composed. The precision was also higher than the S38 semi-eaters, which can be considered a perfect ending for the second-generation Starship. With this, the StarshipTH test flight of Starship officially came to an end. At the same time, the story of Starship VIC also drew to a close at this moment. So how should we evaluate Starship VC at the end of the story? Starship VC made its maiden flight in January 2025 and completed its final act in October 2025 after 5 test flights. It lived a short life of just 10 months. As a brand new generation of Starship, Starship VSE was born with too many expectations. From in-jet orbit refueling to full reusability, from reaching orbit to launching Starlink, all were the goals people envisioned at that time. At the design stage, it was supposed to be a perfect product that swept away all the accumulated code of the previous generation of Starship. From the hull to the engine, every aspect demonstrated its innovative features. However, Starship VIC was inherently flawed. When it was finally ready to take off, the boosters and engines failed to keep up with the pace of Starship's evolution. This forced Starship VFE to use the boosters and engines of the previous generation. After that, Starship VC was even more unfortunate. 3 launches, 3 failures, and 3 different reasons for failure. Everything seemed to start from scratch, returning to the process of accumulating code on the mountain of history. After that, the Starship even exploded before launch, ending before it began. The entire Starship project hit rock bottom at this moment, and many people began to question whether the rapid iteration that the Starship was proud of had failed. But in the midst of despair, the Starship VC began its desperate counterattack and actually successfully completed the remaining flight tests. However, due to the weight occupied by the improvements made after each failure, the actual full recovery payload capacity of the Starship VC had shrunk to about centiliters. For this reason, the production of the Starship VC was quickly halted after only 6 were produced. Starting from S39, the Starship VC, having learned from past experiences and lessons, will make its debut. Unlike the inherent shortcomings of the Starship VC, this time, the newly launched Starship VC not only has the 3rd generation engines, but also the 3rd generation boosters. Under such enhancements, will the Starship VC repeat the old path and experience another explosion? Or will it directly create new glories? All of this, the Starship VC will never see. The Starship story of 2025 began with the first flight of the Starship VC and ended with its retirement.